So in and amongst the major rules changes of 10th edition, it seems that we have some changes to generic power weapons. The Terminator datasheet implies that we might be losing a bit of complexity, so let's talk about whether that's a good or bad thing. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking power weapons in 10th edition, and I thought it was worth discussing one particularly interesting change on that Terminator datasheet and what it might imply for other power weapons in the game at the moment. Power weapons are pretty much a staple of Warhammer 40k, both in the lore and on the tabletop. It certainly wouldn't be Warhammer 40k without Baroque-style weapons energized with glowing energy fields, cutting through flesh, bone, and the thickest armor with ease. They're perhaps most common on the Space Marines and their Chaos counterparts, but that really does comprise of quite a lot of armies in the game. So if Games Workshop does go starting to simplify power weapons, it's going to affect quite a few forces. The interesting bit on the Terminator datasheet that Games Workshop previewed is that they listed the Power Fist, Chain Fist, and then the Sergeant's weapon. On this datasheet it's just called a standard power weapon, when in the past it's always been called a power sword, and given that these datasheets don't need to have the same weapon names as anything else, it really does seem like a deliberate choice to avoid the use of sword here. Admittedly, this is going just a little bit out on a limb here. We don't 100% know this is going to be rolled out to other units, but my guess is that it probably will be. It does seem to be fairly in line with what Games Workshop has done for a bunch of other units towards the tail end of 9th, simplifying the slight variations between different power weapons and slightly altered melee weapons, just to go for a simple profile to keep things the same within a unit. Currently in Warhammer 40k, power swords, axes and mauls all have slightly different stat lines. They got a bit of a boost in 9th edition, all gaining a pip of strength. The axes are currently strength plus 2, AP minus 2 and damage 1. The swords strength plus 1, AP minus 3 and damage 1, and the mauls are strength plus 3 and AP minus 1. I guess it's to represent the different amounts of armor cutting power that they have, and maybe how much weight they have behind them to take down the toughest targets. It does mean that squads that have the option get the chance to tailor between a weapon that's better against units with a high toughness characteristic or a high saves characteristic, directly trading off between the two. On the new Terminator unit though, the standard stat line for something called a power weapon is strength 5, AP minus 2 and damage 1. Certainly more in keeping with a power sword, though losing a pip of AP. It does sound like Games Workshop is going to be reducing AP a little bit across the board going into 10th, trying to rein it back to early 8th edition levels maybe. If this does indeed represent how power weapons throughout the game are going to be represented, I would suspect that it would vary per unit, as Games Workshop have been saying with these weapons. I'd guess that it would kind of represent a strength plus 1, so maybe units like Guardsmen would be strength 4 if they were given a power weapon. They have got a system where they can change it unit on unit, and that won't make any difference. If this does turn out to be the case, I feel like it might represent a bit of a return to a previous time for Warhammer 40k. Going back a few editions, power weapons weren't actually listed in the codexes, it was just a more generic thing that you got in the main big rulebook. There wasn't any sort of differentiation between things like axes or mauls, and they were just listed as power weapon alongside a bunch of other things in the book, such as the standard close combat weapon, the power fist or the thunder hammer for example. I feel like the different profiles maybe crept in as Games Workshop was trying to add more and more features to Warhammer 40k. I feel before the big reset in 8th edition, they generally liked to add more things to make the game more interesting and in-depth, kind of selling points for a new edition, and I feel like the different power weapon profiles were perhaps part of that. I feel like they might make things a bit more interesting, though maybe on some units more so than others, and perhaps Games Workshop's realising that in a big complicated unit it can actually be more of a hindrance than a help. Certainly towards the tail end of 9th edition, they've started going back the other way a little bit. It's maybe going hand in hand with their no models, no rules policy, when rather than letting entire units pick things like entire squads of power swords or axes and things, they lock them to the different war gear within their box, and then that makes for some very weird mixed unit profiles, unless they decide to try and homogenize things a bit. Perhaps one of the most obvious ones was the Chaos Space Marine Terminator and Chosen squads. They didn't get individual power weapon classifications besides Power Fist, they just got all manner of accursed weapons. They were all fairly effective, all strength 5, AP 3 and an extra attack, pretty powerful really, though I feel like some people enjoyed that change more than others. Perhaps other examples might have been the release of that Sisters Novitiate unit. They were armed with all manner of fancy power weapons and things, but rather than having an insanely complex squad for what are basically fairly cheap grunts in the Sisters army as they go, I feel like it did make sense to just unify it under one generic power weapon profile and have them all swing at that so you can roll all the models together. Then also kind of with the last Chaos Codex and the World Eaters release, Khorne Berserkers got their profiles more simplified as well, losing the distinction between things like chain axes and chain swords, just calling them all chain blades, and handing out the Khorne Berserkers one simple but fairly ferocious profile. I feel like some people are more a fan of this than others. Kind of depends maybe if you've already got those units and have a particular commitment to the rules and the profile that they have. But I'd say for the majority of people, perhaps who don't already own the units, I must admit it feels like there are quite a few advantages. I'd say playing minor optimization games between things like swords and axes maybe isn't enormously exciting compared with more meaningful war gear choices, say between the things like power weapons and fists. And I feel like throughout 40k's entire history, when they have had differentials between them, there's almost always been one obvious choice. Perhaps in 40k at the moment, in general the axes and the swords haven't been too badly balanced depending on what's been in the meta so much, but the Mauls have been quite consistently behind, and often for units that could take cheap lightning claws, they were by far the best. Otherwise, for perhaps more annoying things, for units with very mixed split profiles, it can maybe just be a little bit tiresome to roll the different weapons, such as say roll your axes, then your swords, then your mauls, then your lightning claws. The average result might have been better just to roll with a fairly generic weapon to represent the entire unit's attacks, rather than fiddling too much between one weapon's minor details versus another. I feel like modelling is a bit of an aspect as well. Some people just like the way that either swords or axes look on their veterans, or even if they're kind of fine with either of them and they just happen to have assembled with them with all of one weapon rather than another, and then Games Workshop inevitably changes the rules slightly, and the other one becomes the one that you really want on your models if you want to run them with their best rules. Just a bit frustrating if Games Workshop are making people choose between basically clipping off their nice weapons that they've made and playing with some rules that are a little bit weaker than everyone else's. I guess that's already something that happens a fair bit in Warhammer 40k, but perhaps choice of minor power weapons perhaps take that to a bit more of an extreme than it really needs to be. I guess you could always proxy if you wanted to, but even that's a little bit annoying. Finally, certainly some of the datasheets in 9th edition combining Games Workshop's no model, no rules policy with the minor variations in power weapon and things, it can mean that they can get really quite bloated with loads of mixed war gear. I feel like perhaps the Death Guard Plague Marines are the biggest example of that. Loads of bits with fairly slightly different power weapons. It currently makes sense to take literally all of them within a squad because they're all free, and it just means that their datasheet really is quite stacked with a whole load of individual options for individual war gear bits, just because Games Workshop likes to reflect the options that are in the kit and no more and no less. Certainly if they rolled things into one big plague power weapon type thing, I guess that would be a bit easier to make the unit choices with. I feel if they did go a bit heavier on making power weapons a bit more generic though, it wouldn't please everyone. It does take away from unit customization just a little bit. I guess you are removing options even if they are kind of minor ones, and I guess it might make those units theoretically just a little bit less powerful. Perhaps if you're able to pick between a few different profiles and just choose the best one, if you've only got one option then the unit more or less just does what it does. I feel like people are perhaps a little bit happier to accept some of these things being rolled together than others. I feel like the Chaos Terminator lightning claws losing their reroll to wound was something that people weren't the biggest fans of. I think people might care a little bit less if it had a bit less disparity within the game. Say if you're comparing Chaos Terminator lightning claws to ones that the loyalists get, losing the reroll to wound on their ones arbitrarily does feel a bit bad, but if everyone's lightning claws just worked exactly the same, then I guess it wouldn't. Finally, if this does indeed turn out to be a thing, and the Terminator power weapon does mean that they're lumping a few common ones together, I feel like there are plenty of Space Marine units that might well get their power weapons mixed. Perhaps some of the most obvious are things like Space Marine Sergeants and Vanguard Veterans. They lose a few options, but have things rolled together, presumably into that Strength 5 AP-2 profile. And I guess that might also be the same for units like Space Wolf Thunderwolves. I'd guess that Sanguinary Guard could be another potential choice. Their main options are between the axes and the swords, and they don't really have quite enough of the axes in the kits to equip an entire squad with them, so it's possible the Incarmin weapons might just be Oncarmin blades from now on. I feel like perhaps the Death Guard have got a couple of usable options, maybe the Blight Lord Terminators, axes versus swords, and as mentioned before with the Plague Marines, I actually kind of liked what they did on that fake leaks datasheet that we had the other day. They consolidated a few of the funkier bits of kit into a greater plague weapon. That might well be a reasonable idea, I feel. I guess Grey Knights could be another option, though I guess with not all that many units to field, any more differentiation might well help them. They usually have their debate of swords versus staves, halberds and falchions. Again, often arbitrarily, one of them will usually wind up being the best. Finally, I guess things like Space Marine characters might well get a more generic power weapon as standard, perhaps just a master-crafted power weapon as opposed to an axe, mace or sword. I feel like though for characters, if Games Workshop wanted to, there wouldn't really be all that much harm in keeping them with their fancy different profiles. It's a lot easier to remember and look up on a single model with one weapon, rather than 10 different models within a squad of mixed power weapons. Anyway though, let me know what you think. Does this Terminator power weapon represent a whole load of profiles being smashed together somewhat? And how keen would you be for any of the previously mentioned units to have a more consolidated profile, or keep their individual rules for things like axes, swords and maces? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Allspecs Tactics, while certainly keep the regular 40k discussion coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more interesting things thrown up by 10th edition. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Allspecs Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that one linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.